Ladies and gentlemen, welcome everybody to our second evening of our winter online lecture series, Naturnahe Beweidung im Fokus, or focusing on near-natural grazing. Our previous guest 5 weeks ago was Professor Jens Christian Svenning from Aarhus University in Denmark, and his talk can be found now on our YouTube channel, Naturnahe Weidelandschaften. For tonight, it is a great honor and pleasure to welcome Isabella from Knepp Estate, Sussex in UK. She's a writer, conservationist, and one of the most inspiring voices in the European rewilding scene. Before the recent story of Knepp began, Isabella studied classics, that's ancient Greek and Latin, at London University, and she traveled widely as a writer and journalist, reporting on conservation and culture issues from India, Nepal, Papua New Guinea, Mexico, and beyond. And her first book was about an ornithologist, the Birdman, a biography of John Gould, and later she started writing for National Geographic, for The Guardian, for the Time magazine, and quite some other leading journals. Isabella lives with her husband, Charlie Burrell, at Knepp Estate, right in the middle of our evening's subject, which was once an unprofitable conventional farm of 1,400 hectares, but which should become subject to probably one of Europe's most audacious experiments in rewilding, and one of the most successful conservation projects all over Britain and Europe. After years of agricultural failures, without earning any money, Isabella and Charlie made an outstanding and radical decision in the year 2000 that included a total stop of plowing and crop production and a shift to low-intensity meat production of cattle, pig, red and fallow deer, plus some other branches like safari, campground, and social events. For that, they were harshly accused of, that's a citation, an affront to the efforts of every self-respecting farmer, an immoral waste of land, and assault on Britishness itself. So that's really strong tobacco. But what followed has become a story of ecological recovery that has surprised scientists and conservationists across Britain and beyond. Within only a few years, Knepp saw an amazing return of nature, including nightingales, turtle doves, peregrine falcons, horseshoe bats, purple emperor butterflies, and many other rare and threatened species, including the recovery of flora and soil. A rich and self-willed ecosystem emerging from what was once an exhausted farmland. Isabella has captured this wild journey brilliantly in her international bestseller, Wilding, The Return of Nature to a British Farm, which has sold more than 300,000 copies and was one of the Smithsonian's top 10 science books for 2018. It has been translated into 8 languages, including German, as Wildes Land, published by Dumont Verlag. Her latest work, the book of Wilding, co-authored with her husband, Charlie Burrell, is more a practical guide to rewilding, but with a lot of theory and scientific background. And there is also a movie about it, but unfortunately, there is apparently no way of seeing it in Germany. At least I tried several times in vain. Anyway, Isabella's achievements have been recognized with numerous awards and honors, including the Royal Geographical Society's Ness Award, the Zoological Society of London's Silver Medal, and an honorary doctorate from the University of Sussex. What makes her work so powerful, in my opinion, is her ability to demonstrate that bringing back nature can really be done. And it can be done within a few years, provided we allow it. So we definitely need one of the big German players of landowners, e.g. an NGO, a foundation, a public institution, or a private investor, just to press copy and paste Knepp. So please join me in welcoming Isabella Tree. Isabella, please go ahead. The word is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, lovely to be here and wonderful to see so many people joining. Thank you so much for having me. I make no apologies, I'm afraid, for starting this presentation with a slide as gloomy as this, but I think we really do have to start every sort of thought process about how we're going to be managing our land with the bare, stark facts that our planet is on fire. We need to do something now. So the great American biologist E.O. Wilson, in one of his last books, Half Earth, talked about how the desperate need to support life systems on Earth that sustain all species, including our own, we need to devote half Earth, 50% of our terrestrial land and 50% of oceans to nature. That is an enormous ask. We've gone some way, I think, to realizing that that is necessary in the COP15 Montreal Agreement in 2022, over nearly 200 countries signed up to the 30 by 30 agreement, which is pledging that these countries, most countries in Europe, will be devoting 30% of their land and 30% of their waters to nature by 2030. But that is only 5 years away. How on earth are we going to do that? We're going to have to think radically differently and think of ways that we can do this really, really fast. So I think rewilding is a really powerful solution to getting that amount of land dynamic and functioning again. It's relatively inexpensive to set up. It requires minimal management, so it's very low cost. And it can even work on land with no notable value for nature. So on really depleted farmland where it's non-profitable. And that's certainly what we found at Knepp, where we are. So this is a photograph, an image of Knepp, which to me looks like it could be anywhere in the wilderness. And yet here we are underneath the stacking system of Gatwick Airport, surrounded by A roads in the busiest, most congested part of Britain. So our experiment is on 3,500 acres. It's 1,400 hectares, as Herbert said. And it's shown us how dramatically nature can rebound if we let it. So this was our farm before we began rewilding. It was ploughed for arable. We also had dairy cows. You can see we were ploughing right up to the trunks of those trees. That was the tiny little bit of nature that we'd left. And we thought we were being good stewards of the land. We thought, like most farmers, that we were doing a good thing. We were producing food, but we were also looking after nature. All our land had been drained. All the permanent pasture and the wildflower meadows had been ploughed up since the Second World War. Our hedges were cut at the end of summer because we couldn't get, machinery onto the land because our land is so heavy. And so there were no berries for wintering birds and small mammals. And our soil was completely lifeless. It had 70 years of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and enormous amounts of artificial fertilizer chucked on it. So this is what our land actually looks like close. We sit on 320 meters of heavy Sussex clay. When I was writing my book Wilding, I found that there were 35 different words in our local dialect for mud. This is how much it dominates our lives. And for 17 years, we tried to farm this stuff. This is what my husband had trained to be. He trained to be a farmer. He slipped into that kind of mindset. This is what he was going to do. For 17 years, he tried to turn the profits around, but we just couldn't do it. For 6 months of the year, we couldn't get heavy machinery onto the land, so we couldn't sow spring crops. We simply couldn't compete with prime agricultural land on lovely, loamy, free draining soils. And with globalization and farming subsidies being overhauled, really the writing was on the wall. We had to change. We had to do something different. We were 1.5 million pounds in debt by 1999. So we were really inspired by the work of the Dutch ecologist Frans Vera, who I know has done a talk for you. And it just happened that his book, Grazing Ecology and Forest History, was translated into English in 2000, the year really when for us the shit hit the fan and we really realized we had to give up farming. So it was a really opportune moment to kind of open our eyes and think differently about how our land could be managed. And we went out to the Svanesplassen to see what he was talking about, and his vision of what temperate zone Europe looked like in the past before human impact was really exciting, we thought. How we have forgotten about all the enormous herds of animals that would have roamed Europe in numbers that we just can't even imagine now, but that, you might be familiar with in Africa perhaps, but certainly not in Europe. But there would have been herds of tens of thousands of aurochs, of numbers of hundreds of thousands of tarpan. We'd have had European bison in several different species. We'd have had European water buffalo, elk, wild boar, of course, and beavers by the millions. All these keystone species that would have been driving the habitat, creating disturbances, and really shifting the kaleidoscope that makes complicated habitats that wildlife loves. And we've forgotten about these animals mainly because we've either driven them to extinction by hunting, or we've pushed them out of our agricultural land into the kind of margins, the hilltops and the mountains and the really inaccessible areas where they're not going to bother us. So we've completely forgotten about living with these enormous numbers of animals and how important their influence was on the landscape and on biodiversity. So we thought it'd be really exciting to see if we could do an experiment on our post-agricultural land drenched in chemicals. Could we do something along the lines, the vision of Franz Vera? Could we allow vegetation to come of its own devices, to naturally recolonize, allow it to scrub up and for trees to start colonizing, and then introduce these free roaming animals to mess it about a bit and to create the kind of magic that is rocket fuel for wildlife? So we had fantastic fun in the beginning. We pulled up all the internal fences, we smashed up the Victorian land drains, we allowed the water to sit where it had always wanted to sit. And over 7 years, we let the arable fields lie open after their last harvest so that the land could scrub up, so we could get blackthorn, hawthorn, dog rose, brambles to colonize the open arable fields. And then we ring fenced the whole area and started introducing our herds of free roaming animals. So we have red deer and fallow deer here. They have a fantastic impact on the environment. Obviously, the numbers is crucial. You've got to have the right numbers or you over impact the environment. But here we have horses, Exmoor ponies imitating their ancestor, the tarpan, eating in a very different way to cattle. They'll eat thistles and all the stuff that the cows actually don't want to eat. And the cows, we have Old English Longhorn, an old breed of English cows that are behaving very like an aurochs, but obviously browsing as well as grazing. We forget that cows don't just eat grass, they're huge browsers as well. And here are our Tamworth pigs doing a very good imitation of a wild boar. And what's amazing is when you see these de-domesticated animals in a wild environment, how expressive they are. Who'd have thought that Tamworth pigs could behave like hippos? We see these pigs diving into the ponds and eating swan mussels off the bottom of the lake. They're ingenious creatures. And all of these animals disturb the land in a totally different way. They have different eating habits. They have different disturbances. And they're also, their dung is regenerating the soil, but they're also transporting seeds around the landscape in their hooves and their guts and their fur. And so everything they do has a kind of knock-on effect for other life. And seeing the habitats that these animals created was really for us a complete epiphany. These bushes, these shrubs suddenly looked like really outlandish things, like as if a gardener had been topiarying them, or and creating these amazing sort of structures. And you can see here how the animals have been grazing very tightly, browsing at the bottom of these shrubs, creating very thorny, spiky kind of pincushions at the bottom. And as soon as the shrubs get above the browse line, they kind of feather out in these massive, sort of beautiful, exuberant kind of sort of headdresses. And to us, it looks really strange, but actually, this is probably what these shrubs are meant to do. So what we began to realize is how in our Western mindset, we separate flora and fauna. When we study science, we study botany separately to zoology. But obviously, the two have co-evolved together. They're totally interdependent. And so the idea that, animals may need plants to eat, but actually plants need animals too in order to disperse across the landscape, but also uh, to help them metabolize and to actually help them to draw down carbon, sometimes even to stimulate the way they pull up nutrients from the soil, but also to extend their longevity. So there's all these hidden kind of interrelationships that flora and fauna have together. And it's really interesting how rewilding kind of brings that idea out again. Even something as innocuous as crab apples, these are naturally regenerated. The seed has come in or they've been planted by a bird, and these wonderful apple trees have recolonized Knepp. They don't have thorns, but when they're browsed, their twigs turn into really sharp spikes. So even these innocuous looking beautiful plants can defend themselves against herbivory. And here we've seen how browsing can actually create really interesting kind of scalloped edges. This is very early on in the project, about 4 or 5 years in. And this was a traditional hedgerow, which had been clipped into kind of like a long straight line while we were farming. But this, just a few years in, has been allowed to billow out. And you can see how the grazing of the animals, and particularly the cows, creates this kind of scalloped edging effect. And that's really important because suddenly you have these little harbors where insects can kind of retreat in when it's really stormy or rainy or windy. They can still find places where they can feed in the shelter of these thorny bushes. And also because of the browsing, we get this very dense, particularly of blackthorn. So it provides fantastic, really spiny, close, dense cover for birds and for small mammals. And here where you have the three red stars are where we have nightingale territories. So really close together, we have three breeding pairs of nightingales. And we also now have dormice in this hedgerow. Again, another species we never expected to see at Knepp. People have been talking about reintroducing it in the south east, but now they have just found us because the habitat is there for them. So just even if you're not rewilding in a big area, you can see how just changing your hedgerow, allowing your hedges to grow out, allowing access for browsing animals can really create fantastic habitat for wildlife. And this in itself can become a wildlife corridor, joining up areas of nature together. So now we have exploding kind of hedgerows all over the place, if you like. We now have kind of colonization of thorny scrubs everywhere across the Rewilding project. And we have fantastic habitat now for linnets, dunnock, bullfinches, song thrushes. And obviously the insects, this is all providing food for insects with leaf and flower buds and seeds and berries. And we now have huge numbers of breeding birds that are rapidly declining elsewhere in the UK, like cuckoos, yellowhammers, and whitethroats. And in autumn, we have clouds of redwings and rare passage migrants like grasshopper warblers, tree pipits, and redstarts. And a couple of years ago, the British Trust for Ornithology did a breeding bird survey here and found that we have probably the highest density of breeding songbirds in Britain. And so this is just in 20 years. So one of the things we're really keen about at Knepp is to change the mindset about thorny scrub. We now know it's one of the most diverse habitats we have. And yet in most of our modern landscapes, it's considered we have zero tolerance for it. So we have to think differently and more positively about thorny scrub and how we can tolerate it wherever it appears, if we can, in our landscapes. So because of the abundance of songbirds and small mammals and other prey, we've obviously got these guys now. We have all 5 species of UK owl, we have red kites, we have ravens for the first time at Knepp in 100 years, we have sparrowhawks, buzzards, we have white-tailed eagles now regularly roosting with us from a reintroduction project on the Isle of Wight just off the south coast. We have peregrine falcons, usually associated with cathedrals and cliffs, nesting in a tree, which is almost unheard of. So suddenly our skies are busy. We've got an airscape of fear, if you like. And that's had a really interesting effect on other wildlife at Knepp. So one of the few things that was notable for nature at Knepp before we began rewilding was our heronry. And the herons were nesting on the tops of the oak trees. But now that we've got all these guys in the air, they've begun to nest halfway down the tree. So they're hiding from all these raptors, which is a really interesting new phenomenon. And we're very open-minded towards non-natives. So we're happy to have Egyptian geese and mandarin ducks, escaped exotics breeding here. And it's so interesting, I think, to see that the more diverse and the more functioning an ecosystem is, the harder it is for non-natives to become a problem. And we saw this really distinctly when about 8 years ago, we saw a flock of ring-necked parakeets. So I don't know about in Germany, but certainly in Britain now, ring-necked parakeets in London and other cities is really common. You hear them screeching around, and I rather love them, but they, are very, very different to our native wildlife. And we saw a flock of these, maybe about 8 parakeets appear at Knepp, and we thought, okay, this is the new normal. Welcome, new arrivals. But they stayed for about 2 days and then disappeared. And we think it's because there was just so much action in the skies that they were hounded out by these guys. So where you're seeing them is in depleted areas in urban parks where you don't have that kind of airscape of fear. It's very important as well, we feel, we often talk about the number of different species we have and the rarity of those species, but abundance of species is also incredibly important to remember. And so, just for example, we have a ringer who spent his whole life ringing birds, Tony Davis. And then over a couple of weeks, in 1 month in 2018, he ringed more lesser whitethroats and blackcaps in 2 fields at Knepp than he had done in his entire career. So that abundance, again, is something that's shifting the baseline the opposite way. We're beginning to understand that the land can actually carry much, much more abundance of life than we ever believed before. It's taking even ecologists and, the experts by surprise. So our ambitions for what nature areas can hold is actually becoming much, much higher than it ever was before. We also feel it's very important to do a baseline survey before you begin rewilding, and that's been hugely important so we can actually prove the uplift in all these species that have come back and the abundance, having done all the work at the very beginning. And we'd advise any rewilder to undertake a baseline survey before they begin. Even in a garden, it can prove enormously interesting and satisfying, but it can also add to the knowledge building around natural processes and how they can revive. So birds are obviously the most conspicuous indicators of biodiversity. They're the easiest to see and to monitor, but insects have also become really important indicators of our ecosystem health. Many of them, of course, have multi-habitat life cycles, so they can indicate habitat complexity. And some of them can be very, very specific and just depend on a single species, like the yellow loosestrife bee, depending on yellow loosestrife. So really important to us that we have enormous numbers of invertebrate species. We have over 80, this is old actually, we've probably got closer to 2,000 invertebrate species now, including a new fly to Britain. And a couple of years ago, we found a colony of large tortoiseshell butterflies breeding at Knepp. And this was really exciting because this was a species that was thought to have been extinct in the UK 50 years ago. So somehow these species are clinging on in tiny pockets somewhere. Give them the chance and the food and the habitat, and they come back. It's like a kind of miracle. And we have 8 new species of dragonfly recorded at Knepp. That's really important for us because it shows that our water is also cleaner. Now we've become a kind of a filtration influence on water that's pouring into Knepp. The water coming onto Knepp is polluted by farmland and roads around us, But by the time it's been sitting on Knepp and it's been through that filtration process of our soils and our vegetation, it's actually clean sitting water. So that's why we now have fantastic dragonflies. And this is a game changer, really interesting, dung beetles. We've known dung beetle populations rocketing at Knepp thanks to our organic dung, of course. And that's why we have so many little owls that are beetle specialists. And we have a dung beetle, a large dung beetle that hasn't been recorded in Sussex for 50 years, the violet door beetle. But this was a really interesting survey that a student did at Knepp. They collected in a transect in a certain amount of time over 500, just over 500 dung beetles from an organic farm abutting Knepp, but nearly 12,000 dung beetles at Knepp in the same amount of time. And they were absolutely amazed by that, and also slightly horrified, because that meant that they were also killing these dung beetles the way they were catching them. And this poor student never killed, 1,000 dung beetles in a go, let alone 12,000. But what it showed is that what's happening in an organic farm, dung beetles are, obviously a keystone species. They're hugely important for pulling dung down into the soil and restoring the soil. They reduce the amount of disease burden on the soil if you're in a livestock farming situation. So they save farmers enormous millions and millions of pounds a year because of that operation of pulling down dung into the soil. But what this student found was that there were far fewer dung beetles on the organic farm, and that's because they were bringing their animals in over winter. And dung beetles are active all year round. So what was happening on even an organic farm where you'd think their soils would be fantastic was you had this catastrophic collapse in dung beetles every winter. So it's just one way that we can show that having rewilded areas can help organic farming systems, because when those animals on the organic farm are let out in the spring, our dung beetles will be flying over there instantly to take advantage of their organic dung. So it's just one species that can be provided by a rewilding system that cannot naturally completely carry on in a farming system. So farming and rewilding can really work together hand in glove, and actually rewilding can support agricultural systems in many, many ways. One aspect of the ecosystem that we didn't measure at the start of the project is the soil. And looking back, this is absolutely astonishing oversight. But 20 years ago, no one was looking at the soil. And very early on, we saw really exciting indicators of soil recovery. Studies by Imperial College London in 2013, again using a neighbouring farmer as a kind of control to compare with Knepp, found that a really significant rise in all three categories of earthworm at Knepp, including those really important vertical burrowing and gneissic earthworms that really make a difference. And they're a keystone species, obviously, as Darwin himself identified. But we'd been told at the beginning of our project that gneissic worms can only colonize at the speed of about 1 meter a year. And for Charlie and me, that was terrifically depressing. We thought, well, we're never going to see these worms in our lifetime in the middle of our fields. But actually, they're already here. They've colonized so fast. They've shown that science yet again is wrong, that they can actually, in the right conditions, they can colonize very, very fast. And we now have 19 species of earthworm, which is really an astonishing number. So thanks from the evidence at Knepp and from other rewilding projects coming on stream in the UK, just to see the difference, you have to keep your eye. It's so different, the landscape now, but this is obviously a field at Knepp. You keep your eye on the oak tree in the background, and you can see the change. But it's often said, okay, well, rewilding is fantastic for biodiversity. It's great for bringing back the birds and the bees, but what can it do for climate change? It's a one-trick pony. What else can it do? And I've never understood that, because surely if you're bringing back a functioning ecosystem that is producing fantastic biodiversity, you must be storing carbon at the same time. You're storing carbon in your soils, and you must be storing carbon in your vegetation as well. Well, now we have the evidence to prove it. 3 years ago, a company called AgriCarbon, and they were funded by the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, NERF, which is a government-funded project. started taking samples out of our soil. Thousands of samples were taken in 1.6 meter cores, up to a meter deep, so per hectare. And so a really big data set, so thousands of core samples, and they were taking 4 different samples from each core. And what they found was that in the Rewilding project, we were storing between 3.3 to 4.8 tons of carbon equivalents per hectare per year. So that didn't mean anything to me. I mean, the director of AgriCarbon was absolutely amazed by this. But I asked her to try and explain why that was so exciting. And she said, well, for example, if you put it into context, in a new broadleaf woodland plantation that sequesters carbon in trees at an average of 3.2 tons of carbon equivalent per year. So what we've shown is that just the soil at Knepp is sequestering more carbon than a woodland plantation. And that is really significant, because if you think that on top of the soil, we've got all that new vegetation, and we've got trees, and we've got new wetland, which is fantastic at storing carbon, a rewilding project is way more effective at storing carbon than planting trees. So that is a really interesting result, because it shows that we can now have an incentive to drive ourselves away from this kind of forestry plantation model that can be so destructive for the environment and for biodiversity. So here we've shown that the new vegetation growth on our Rewilding project. This is a project we're working with Oxford University and Exeter, Cranbourne, Nottingham, and Queen Mary universities. And they've identified using LiDAR that we have an estimated 3.7 million cubic meters of new woodland and scrubland across Knepp. So again, that's a really interesting amount of carbon that's being stored. And this is what my daughter, Nancy Burrell, now Dr. Nancy Burrell, as well, she will be graduate next weekend. And this is the work that she's been doing, is identifying, quantifying the amount of carbon that is stored in all those woody shrubs, all the blackthorn, hawthorn, dogrose, and the small regenerating oak trees, that has never been measured before, never been focused on before. We've always looked at trees in woodland plantations, and we've looked at mature trees. But these shrubs are storing 3 times more carbon than was previously thought, thanks to our daughter Nancy's thesis. But she's also teaching drones to be able to measure, to quantify the amount, the vegetation mass, but also the root systems underground and how much carbon they're storing. Because in the presence of free-roaming animals, of browsing animals, those root systems are being stimulated to store much more carbon than trees and shrubs in a landscape without herbivory. Because they put down, when they're being browsed, they put down emergency resources into their roots. So you can have a sweet spot where browsing is both stimulating carbon in the root systems and regrowth above ground. So really interesting how that effect of herbivory is actually increasing carbon storage in rewilding projects. And then to prove how we're beginning to understand how to measure the carbon that's being stored in all the different environments at Knepp, but we also need to have a kind of net figure to show how much we're storing overall. So with Exeter University, we're using flux towers like this one to measure the total greenhouse gas emissions from the Rewilding project, so that we can set them against our carbon storage calculations and come up with a net figure. So at last, I think we can prove that rewilding is good for biodiversity, but it is also essential for pulling carbon out of the air, and actually combating climate change. A game changer. So rewilding has been catching on in recent years in Britain, and the charity Rewilding Britain estimates that now there are more than 150,000 hectares of land under private ownership, mostly private ownership, and Knepp-style rewilding projects in England alone. And it's mostly private landowners, I think, at the forefront, basically because it's easier, like us here at Knepp, to take a unilateral decision and just say, forget the naysayers, forget all the flack that's coming at you from different angles, just do it. And it's very different, I think, in NGOs or institutions where you have like the National Trust or the RSPB, to do that, when you have to bring with you a whole hierarchical a sort of body of people and all your followers or subscribers as well, and the general public who feel they have a say. So I think that's why the private individuals, the private landowners have been at the forefront. But now we're beginning to see that the NGOs are changing their tune as well and beginning to manage their land holdings in a much wilder way, and some of them also going into rewilding as well. But there is a general fear, I think, amongst perhaps the public, but also certainly amongst farmers, that rewilding represents chaos, that somehow we might lose our kind of cultural landscapes under a morass of ragwort and thorny scrub and wetland. And so rewilding is often presented in the media as all or nothing. You know, we're going to rewild everywhere. So really, in order to kind of persuade people and to kind of perhaps get rid of some of that fear factor, we've come up with some images to kind of envisage how our landscapes can change under rewilding and how they can be, where rewilding fits into our landscapes. So this is a series of images that we published in our book, The Book of Wilding. And this is basically a landscape that was taken from Cumbria. It's actually lowland Cumbria. And what we've done is we asked this wonderful illustrator, you may be familiar with him, Haroon Helmer, he's a Dutch illustrator, does a lot of work for Rewilding Europe. And so he's basically illustrated it for us, how we can change this landscape. So here we have his image, and we can see there's a canalized river, there's roads, there's very organized arable fields, just like Knepp used to be. And this is how we can begin to change it. So here we have the up in the right hand corner and over on the left, you can see the kind of, these could be areas where you've got rewilding projects. So on a sort of maybe 400 hectares at least, say on a kind of Knepp principle. So you've got a breeding hotspot, you've got free roaming animals there, you've got species longing to spill out into the greatest countryside. But at the moment, they're not going to find any habitat there in which to breed and feed. So instantly you can create wildlife corridors like the hedgerows that I described earlier, but maybe wider, that you can actually create to connect those biodiversity hotspots together. So creating climate corridors too that can help species move with climate change. And hedgerows too can be fantastic wildlife corridors. And so we need to be thinking bigger. And here in Europe, you know, you have some amazing, this is in Germany, it's that, you know, you'll be familiar with it, the European green belt that was the former Iron Curtain. We need to be thinking bigger about our wildlife corridors. We're not doing this in England yet, but we're taking the example from you in Germany and elsewhere. And obviously we've got to get rid of those roads, because, or do solve those roads somehow, because they're death traps. And again, Europe is leading the way in this, road bridges all over Europe, fantastic road bridges. We've got 2 in Britain so far, and they're not even designed for wildlife. So we're absolutely hopeless about this. This is something we're really trying to campaign for. And then we have to think about how we get margins for nature around our agricultural fields. So margins around all those hedgerows. And we know that if you do that, even if you're doing conventional chemical farming, that still increases your yield. Sacrificing a margin for nature around your fields still increases your yield. And that's because you're increasing the pollinating insects, so you can, and you've got natural pest control, so you can reduce your reliance on pesticides, but you're also helping to provide a buffer and actually provide a sort of microclimate that helps retain water, helps restore your soils. But we have to everywhere move to regenerative farming, and we're beginning to see some really exciting movements in that in the UK. We have a farming conference now that has grown really big called Groundswell, which is farmers themselves who are realizing that they are losing their soil, that it's incredibly expensive to carry on relying on fertilizers, and particularly when you have wars and you don't have your fertilizer coming from big producers like the Ukraine, but you're also relying on pesticides and chemicals. And we've got to shift the way we do that, or we're going to lose our topsoil and I mean, in some places, I think in Britain, we've only got 20 harvests left. So shifting to regenerative farming can produce just as much food as chemical farming, but obviously without the side effects. And these are some of the other pioneers, you may be familiar with them, who are pioneers of regenerative agriculture. But again, to add to this, I would say Henry Dimbleby's food strategy report was really influential. His book has just come out. It's called Ravenous. Really interesting about how we can do food and farming for the future without destroying the infrastructure on which farming itself depends. And then, of course, we've got to have areas for wood pasture. That's one of the most biodiverse habitats there is. So growing trees while at the same time pasturing livestock, so we can have agroforestry. But we've also got to think differently about how we restore our water systems, our floodplains, not just to help protect farmland and towns and property from flooding, obviously, but also to help clean our polluted waterways and to stimulate biodiversity. And obviously, one of the most obvious things you could do is to put beavers in. Probably one of the most important keystone species. You'll know all about these, but we still in Britain have not got them out in the wider landscape, at least not legally, at least. We've got black ops and beaver bombers out there doing it illegally. But so far, the government has still not allowed these creatures to get back into our landscapes. And we need to have a management plan, such as you have in places like Bavaria, which show how managing beavers, having a plan, can really allow farmers to live alongside these keystone species. It's a hugely important step we need to take to recover our landscapes and our biodiversity, but also to store carbon. And here we can see in Haroon's lovely illustration, you've got beavers, but you've also got elk, and you've got bison, and you've got European water buffalo. So how amazing to have these habitats back, where again, more accessible for people. There's some people kayaking on these wonderful waterways. There's actually wildlife to look at. So suddenly these landscapes, instead of being very hostile and kind of green deserts, become very porous for human beings as well. But we also have to address the issue of monoculture plantations. We're just talking about how, the soil under rewilding can store more carbon than plantations. But we can also manage our plantations better, having, continuous cover cropping and allowing dead wood to continue standing. We can just be clever about how we manage our productive woodland and forestry. So this isn't a static landscape now. It's productive, it's sustainable, it's teeming with wildlife, and every area of the scene will now be drawing down carbon. But it's also a landscape far more welcoming for nature-based activities like walking and cycling and kayaking and bird watching, really stimulating the rural economy. And this is something we've seen at Knepp. So when we were farming, we employed 23 people. Now that we've rewilded, we're now employing 100 people. So it's not about excluding people from the landscape at all. It's quite the opposite. It's about stimulating the rural economy and getting people back into the landscape. So now we've begun to think, well, okay, we've got this wonderful biodiversity hotspot at Knepp. Now what do we do? So this is what our next step is going to be over the coming years, is how do we connect Knepp with other areas? And this is what we're calling our Wheel to Waves project. And you can Google it and look at the website online. But it's essentially connecting Knepp with the sea. You can see Knepp at in the very middle of this map, and essentially it's rewilding 3 river catchments: the Arun, the Ada, which Knepp is on, and the Ouse. So it's almost like a trident going down to the south coast, and it's so important here for us to connect with the south coast because we have a marine protection area, one of the few functioning marine protection areas we have in Britain, that is 300 kilometres square of natural kelp restoration. And all along the south coast, it's built up with housing and developments, and even the little bits of nature that still exist are busy with dog walkers. And so it's very, very difficult to find places where terrestrial nature recovery and marine can meet again. But here we have one place, particularly the Climping Gap on the south coast, where a farmer has gone into partnership with us, and he is devoting several fields, big fields on his coastline, to surrender them to salt marsh again. And he has been the driver behind this plan to talk to farmers and landowners in these corridors and to persuade them to create space for nature on their farms. Now, already we have about 20,000 hectares pledged in this 100-mile corridor by farmers and landowners to create more space for nature. They're not necessarily going to be rewilding. They may be staying in agriculture. They may even be staying in conventional agriculture, but they will be doing things that they feel they feel within is in their capacity, allowing hedgerows to grow out, allowing woodland to regenerate and to increase, sacrificing fields on floodplains, that sort of thing, to kind of, but in a kind of like a jigsaw, piece it together so that eventually we can have some sort of corridor moving through this landscape. It's really exciting. We already have 1,000 individual gardeners as well, so it can go right down as small as a garden. That can connect in this landscape. And this is, again, something we're really keen to get across in our new book, that rewilding is a spectrum and everyone is on it. So this is adapted from Professor Sir John Lawton's cartoon, his graph, to show that, you can have huge wilderness areas at one end, and you don't have to manage them hardly at all because they're so big and they've got naturally functioning ecosystems with apex predators and the rest. But the smaller you go, the more management you have to do to have dynamic ecosystems happening. And this is true even for a garden. So a garden, we feel you can certainly rewild your garden, but you need to be thinking differently. So it doesn't mean closing the garden gate and just letting it go. It means using certain interventions to, think like a beaver, to think like a water buffalo. And that way you can create the kind of habitats that insects and other wildlife love. And of course, in gardens, if you think connectively and you actually talk to your neighbors, perhaps even pull up the fences between you and create holes in those fences so that you can have hedgehog motorways along those back gardens. You can see how those gardens themselves can become wildlife corridors. And if we could have trees in those streets, again, they become stepping stones for birds to be able to much more easily cross roads, because even a street or a road is actually still a bit of an obstacle for birds. We know that if there are trees in a street, they find it much easier, along with insects, to move through the cityscape. And just to give an idea of the kind of thinking that we're holding a gardens conference in January in Manchester, a 2-day gardens conference called Wilding Gardens, trying to move the dial on how people think about their gardens and getting rid of those ghastly green lawns that don't give any life at all. And this was a rewilded garden that actually won the Best in Show at Chelsea in 2022. So Chelsea being the kind of pinnacle of the kind of garden world, and it absolutely outraged the Royal Horticultural Society. In fact, the debate about who should win this prize was so heated that for the first time in the history of the Royal Horticultural Society, they had to do a secret ballot. But this was based on a beaver dam. And so this garden has all native wildflowers, wetland plants. And in just the week that it was open for the Chelsea Flower Show, it was heaving with insects in the middle of London. And this is what we've done to our own garden at Knepp. This was once a monoculture lawn. It was a croquet lawn. You can't imagine anything more hostile to insects. But in the 3 years that since we've begun rewilding it, we dumped 300 tons of crushed brick and concrete onto the croquet lawn to create a kind of diverse, lumpy, bumpy, dry garden. It doesn't need, we don't water it, we don't put any fertilizer on it. And now it is a self-sustaining garden. And in 3 years, the biodiversity increased 33%. So it's really exciting what you can do in a garden. And this, of course, is how we extend it to cities. The battle for the planet is going to be won or lost in cities because this is where everybody lives these days. And this is where we can get the movement really going to get people thinking about how to rewild in the wider countryside as well as in cities themselves. And so, what we have to do, I feel, is now nothing short of a revolution. We have to hold governments and corporates to account, and even science where it's failed us. But we also have to learn to take a position of humility ourselves and learn lessons from the planet, to look at nature-based solutions of how we can cope with climate change and food production and biodiversity loss by working with nature. So it's about us as human beings assuming an entirely different role. It's about connecting with the earth wherever we are and in a totally different way. It's about us becoming the keystone species that's working for the good of the planet. It's essentially about rewilding ourselves. Thank you.
Isabella, thank you very much for this really inspiring and great talk. I admire you for your courage and for your optimism and for your enthusiasm. And I think without all this project would not have happened. And to me, the greatest thing was to have the courage to do it 20 years ago, because no one else did, and that was the really great thing. I told you before your talk started that we had somebody in Germany who could have done it, but he refused because he didn't have the courage. So I think you encouraged many people to go further in this in rewilding and bringing back nature. And I thank you very much once more. Really amazing. I have some questions.
Sure.
The first thing is we do have a similar project in Germany, which are much smaller, however. And one important question is always, is there a kind of steady state or climax concerning the ratio of open grassland and shrubland and woodland, perhaps? Do you have can you say anything about that in Knepp or from other experiences you made?
Well, this is definitely something we address in the Book of Wilding. And it's a complicated subject because obviously it depends what land you're on, where you are, what the climate's like, your latitude, and there's the sort of kind of habitats around you, I guess. I guess the way we work it out, the way we balance it, or the way we think about it, is the free roaming animals. So because we don't have apex predators, we have to be the control of the animals. And so we don't want the animals coming through a long, hard winter with perhaps a late spring in very bad condition. and we certainly don't want die-offs. We certainly don't want illness. So we grew the numbers of animals very slowly, from very small numbers to begin with, and the herds grew and grew. And then we watched their body condition. And when their body condition coming out of winter began to decline a little, we knew they weren't finding enough food out there in the landscape. And so, for health reasons, for the animals, for animal welfare reasons, but also because of the meat, because you want those animals to put on weight again very quickly in the spring, and they can't do that if they're in poor condition. We then reduce the numbers. So we kind of know what how the animals will come, what number of animals we need to come through winter in good condition. And that is actually also correlates with the amount of scrub and grassland and trees that are in the landscape, which kind of makes sense because the animals have to find the right amount of food out there, but that's also creates a kind of mosaic of habitats that also is kind of maximizes the opportunities for biodiversity. So I think it really depends on the numbers of animals and the variety of animal species you have in the landscape as to how much vegetation as versus grassland that you have out there and other wetland and woodland. If that makes sense. It's complicated, but I think at least in the Book of Wilding, if you are interested, it shows how changing the numbers can also change the value and the differences of the habitat.
I mean, one basic question in European ecology, or let's say climax ecology, is what some botanists say, that without humans, everything would be dense forest. And one important question:
that's without animals.
Are the animals capable of keeping open land?
Absolutely. And you just look at, anywhere, the big rewilding projects in Europe, absolutely. And so, that's where, I was explaining earlier on that we separate botany from zoology. And for the last 200 years, the botanists have been dictating what our landscape looked like. We've had the palynologists, the people studying pollen records. We've had climax vegetation theorists. They've all forgotten about the animals that would have been here. So if you think of a plantation or a closed canopy woodland, well, first of all, think about how poor it is for biodiversity. Closed canopy woodland has very few bird species in it, hardly any flowering plants. And so as soon as you open it up, you get the light in and suddenly things start to happen. So if you put, we tend to think often of apex predators as keystone species, but if you put a wolf or a lynx or a wildcat into a plantation, not much would happen. If you put a buffalo, a bison, a water buffalo, wild boar, and beavers in there, a hell of a lot of things will happen. Trees will come down, openings will happen, wetlands will be created. I mean, so I think large herbivores, we need to think of them as keystone species that can start opening up closed canopy woodland that is an unnatural. The only places in temperate zone Europe, I think, that would have had closed canopy forest in the past, pre-human impact, would have been on very steep slopes and in really inaccessible areas where these grazing animals and browsing animals couldn't get.
Yeah. What makes me really concerned about conservation situation in Germany is that for instance, in national parks, but also in other areas where we explicitly want nature let go, we exclude the large animals, we exclude the mega herbivores, and that would also include their important functions. And this opinion is quite fixed. It is quite it is quite stubbornly fixed in many people who are responsible for that. And I think that would cause quite a number of species to get extinct within a few decades.
Absolutely. And we see, in the UK, we spend, conservationists spend, millions of pounds a year trying to keep birch and other trees from colonizing really rare open heathland habitat. And, if you put some bison in there, job done. And this is what's happened in somewhere like the Kransvlak in the Netherlands. They really understand this thanks to Frans Vera. In the Kransvlak, an area which is only 330 hectares, there was this beautiful sand dune, very sensitive, rare sand dune habitat that was being encroached by trees because the rabbits had died off, and there was nothing to eat down the colonization of trees. And now they've introduced a small herd of bison. And what's happened under the bison, the biodiversity has increased. It's even higher than the number of species than it was when there were just rabbits in there. So these large herbivores, as you say, with the dung and the dung beetles and all the other insects that come with them, and the bison in the Kransvlak are rolling and making these sand wallows, which again become little microclimates, little microcosms, opening up the opportunities for all these other species that couldn't exist there otherwise.
Yeah. Another problem is that many conservationists consider fences as something unnatural, and they believe that wherever you want to create wilderness, you cannot make a fence.
Well, that's nuts. I think our landscape is now so controlled, so fragmented. We have fences everywhere and we have borders everywhere. So, if we want to have areas of wildness and nature, we have to have boundaries to them. But having said that, one of the things that I think might be helping us is, the no fence collars. So, we can certainly have de-domesticated cattle and ponies in those situations being run on collars. So you don't see fences, you've got a virtual fence. I don't know yet if we can do that on bison. Part of me thinks, do you want the collars? But, sometimes they have radio collars anyway. But you would have to radio collar them all, I think, and not just the matriarchs of the herds, to be absolutely sure they are not going to kind of career onto roads. But I think it's more important than aesthetics, this. Our planet, as I go back to that first slide, is in crisis. And we know that when you put bison into an area, there's an area in Romania that was lying fallow, and there's a big study, I think it was by Princeton University, but I could have to look it up, but that showed that once you put bison into this area, the soil began to store more carbon. It became more functional as a carbon sink. And so these animals can actually help the climate as well as biodiversity. We haven't got time to think about, do we like fences or not? Just get these animals back into the landscape as quickly as we can, in whatever way we can.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, we have not yet allowed no fence in Germany, but I think it will come within a few years. Another question, how about diseases of your animals, or perhaps trees or other species? I mean, there are also tree diseases which might eliminate alder or birch or other species totally from a landscape. And how do you handle parasites? Well, worms and other stuff in your animals.
Well, that's the interesting thing. We know what our vet bills were like when we were farming, when we were dairy farming, and we also had sheep. But we have almost negligible vet bills now because our animals are in the right numbers. They are feeding on what they want to eat. They're being able to self-select. So they also self-medicate. We often see the cows eating sallow, the kind of willow that has salicylic acid in it, which is where we get aspirin. So that reduces worm burden. It also reduces aches and pains and inflammation. When a cow gives birth, the first thing it does is it goes to a patch of nettles and eats to replenish its iron stocks. You don't see them eating nettles any other time. So they know, they have this instinct, like a pregnant woman does, what she needs to eat to replenish depleted minerals. They know where to go. They have areas that they favor. We don't know why, but presumably there's a trace element in that soil that they're finding that they want. So they're incredibly healthy, and they're browsing as well as grazing. And we know that also there's an interesting effect if you allow cows to browse. We hear all this stuff about methane production, but if cows are able to feed on herb-rich grassland, the fumaric acid that is contained in many of our native wildflowers, in things like bird's foot trefoil, fumitory, and clovers, all that sort of the natural wildflower meadow flowers, actually suppresses methane production. But so too does the tannins in bark and leaves. So when you see those cows on the video that I showed eating bark and twigs, that's also suppressing methane production. No one, as far as I'm aware, has done a comparative study on the methane production of animals in intensive systems that are eating stuff that they're not designed to metabolize and produce an enormous amount of gas, and free roaming animals in rewilded areas where they're allowed to browse and eat herbs. So that's really interesting. So that really decreases the incidence of disease, but also we have, the dung beetles pulling down the dung into the soil. So you're not getting those static kind of habitats that are going to create kind of bacteria in the system. And of course, we have tree diseases. We have ash dieback at the moment, but we know that actually 20%, maybe more, of ash is resistant to the disease. So really, really important to allow wild trees to recolonize naturally. There's these amazing images of talk about planting trees for kind of resilience and climate change and everything, but actually trees can do that themselves. They're incredibly resilient. They may live for a very long time, but the system that they work with is incredibly biodiverse. So you look at an oak tree, and every single acorn on that 200,000 acorns or whatever it's got on it on the canopy, is each one has a completely different genetic code. And so we have these kind of photographs of pollen plumes coming over the Apennines from Italy into England and pollinating our oak trees. So already our oak trees are growing the new generations that are going to be able to cope with higher climates, hotter climates. But equally, they are pollinating in such a way that they're keeping their genetic diversity, so they're going to be much more resilient to disease. But if you think about the trees that are grown in forestry conditions, they're grown in commercial nurseries from very restricted genetic diversity. They possibly cloned even. They don't have the mycorrhizal fungi associations that allow them to have that natural resilience. And so those are the trees that are going to be much more vulnerable to disease and climate change. So natural colonization is really, really important for trees to be able to resist disease.
Yeah, thank you. Another question about economy. Letting away the building section of Knepp, does the economy hold just from your meat and from subsidies you get for the land?
It does. I mean, when we were farming, we were making possibly a -1 or +1% margin every year. It was a disaster. We now have an ecotourism enterprise, which is glamping and camping and wildlife safaris, that is open from Easter until the end of October. And that turns over nearly 2 million, and we make a 20% margin on that. That's kind of a profit that we could never have even imagined under farming. And that's just on, a small area of land compared to what was under farming. Because it's, the campsite is just in a field. And then we have the meat. And again, that brings in about 150,000 pounds a year, that we sell our meat online within the mainland Britain. But we now have a restaurant and a shop and that again is another big turnover. And then we have, as I mentioned earlier, we had the farm buildings that were literally just costing an arm and a leg before to keep the roof on. They were part of the farm infrastructure, so they weren't bringing in any money. They were just a cost. And over time, admittedly, with capital outlay, we've converted those buildings into lovely offices, into light industrial workshops, or into storage space. And the people who rent those buildings off us, the companies that rent those buildings, employ 200 people. And it's really, really popular. People love driving to the countryside to go to work rather than sitting in a traffic jam going into town. And if you can look out of your window at pigs rootling or nightingales singing, your productivity of your employees goes up, believe it or not. We know that the impact of looking out onto a natural landscape is actually good for the employees. So with all those things, and yes, we still do get a subsidy. It's declining all the time because of post-Brexit. The basic farm payment we were getting, but for Charlie's cleverness, I think, was predicting. It happened later than we thought. Was predicting that these subsidies would change. It's amazing that they haven't changed yet in Europe. But it's been for us the silver lining. We were very, very, I think, disappointed and ashamed and saddened by Brexit, personally speaking. But the silver lining for us is that we have left the common agricultural policy. And so now our farmers are at last beginning to think differently, and they are not being subsidized for growing arable everywhere, irrespective of the impact it has on the landscape. So even now that subsidies are reducing, and we hope we'll be paid subsidies for the public services that our land is producing in terms of tourism and soil improvement and water quality and all the other public services. But even if we have no subsidies at all, our estate is now a viable business.
Wow. I mean, there are really two different kinds of wonder on that. One is the ecological wonder, and the second is the economic wonder, because nobody could ever have believed that you would manage to get out money of that. It's incredible.
I mean, it was a surprise to us as well. And I mean, I have to say, you very kindly said how courageous it was to leave farming and go into rewilding. But, we were £1.5 million in debt. We were against the wall. We had to. And so it was an economic decision. And it was a choice, I think, that it was a lucky choice that we chose rewilding and we met Franz Vera when we did. But we couldn't have foreseen all these other income streams that have come in. And it's not just Knepp. We've seen that with Rewilding Project, Rewilding Britain has done a study on this, a report showing even with rewilding projects that are much newer than us, that have been going for only 5 years, their revenues and their employment has increased.
Last question from my side about carbon. Do you believe that there is a saturation of carbon storage, or do you think it could go on and on and on with that accumulation of carbon every year? I guess there are no empirical data about this, but maybe there are some other clues you have.
I'm not a carbon expert. I mean, this is all new to me, and so I don't think I could answer that, to be honest. I know that it's constantly surprising what rewilding is showing, that even in our heavy clay soils, our topsoil, which is obviously the active part of the soil that is storing carbon, is still deepening. I don't know how long how deep that topsoil can go. So maybe nobody knows yet. Maybe we just have to do it and see, but that is certainly where we've got room for growth, is in that topsoil, which has almost disappeared on our land under farming. So again, I suppose with beaver activity, and we now have beavers. We're supposed to have them in a pen, but they have escaped. Natural England are aware, but let's hope it forces the government's hand to say, okay, they can stay out there. But with beaver dams, that settlement, that sedimentation that goes on in beaver dams again is storing carbon. So maybe that beaver activity also, you know, ultimately, I'm sure there is, a functioning ecosystem ultimately in centuries, I guess, will reach a climax carbon storage. But by then, hopefully, the planetary carbon crisis will be solved.
I guess you're aware of these incredibly thick black soils of European steppe regions where you get humus layers of several meters, and they store immense amounts of carbon, and that must also have accumulated through perhaps centuries or millennia.
Absolutely. And the same with peatland, that we're seeing up here and, in Scotland, and we even have lowland peatland, that we've been farming and trashing, and so reducing that. But absolutely, it goes meters and meters deep. So yeah, who knows?
I think we have to take care of your voice now, Isabella. But we are through with most of the questions, and I just maybe one last question from my side. Did you ever consider water buffaloes for them?
Yes, I would
We
love
have
water
so many
buffalo.
projects about water buffaloes now in Germany. They are really booming because there are many small patches of land, 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 hectares, which are suitable for a small herd of water buffaloes. And this land is really worthless for most farmers. And it's very easy to bring them in. And as soon as they are there, they start digging wallows, and the frogs are hopping on their backs, and it's really great to see them. And there is a relatively recent record of fossil water buffalo from the Moscow area from about 12,000 years ago. So, and haven't there been fossil records from the River Thames in the scene?
I'm not sure about the Thames, but I know that there was definitely a European water buffalo that we hunted to extinction for sure. And I think the Asian water buffalo is very, very close genetically to it. So it works as a perfect proxy. Um, Water buffaloes are used, I think, in about 3 or 4 conservation areas in Britain. And we would love to have them here. We've got so much water and space for them, and we've got a lake that is being encroached by reeds, so they would do a wonderful job on beating back those reeds and creating a much more diverse habitat around the edges of that lake. But um, again, we have public footpaths, and so it's a question of whether we could get water buffalo that are acclimatized to dog walkers, and uh, you know that's the question, but it's definitely on the agenda. Yeah, I would love them.
Okay, so thank you very much. Let's conclude with one remark from one visitor. She wrote, "This is the best Zoom event in the field of conservation I ever experienced."
Oh, lovely.
I also want to add that when I read your book, Wilding, I was also incredibly impressed that it's also, to me, it's, I think, the best books about conservation that have ever been written. And I'm so thankful to you that you are willing to transfer all this knowledge and courage and optimism to other people. And it's really great work. I'm really impressed.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Very, very kind of you to say all that. And yes, well, you must come and see it for yourself.
Yeah, I will definitely. So thanks to all listeners, thanks to all contributors, thanks to Nico very much, and once more thanks to you, Isabella. We are very happy having you had here. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor. So thank you so much.
Bye bye, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.